We are creatures of desire. What we most desire is meaning. What makes us suffer most is a lack of meaning.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Marital therapist, author, and communications trainer Andrew G. Marshall invites guests from all walks of life to discuss what makes life meaningful.
Hello, I'm Andrew G. Marshall, and welcome to The Meaningful Life. We're available on Apple, Spotify, Podbeam, and wherever you find your podcasts. When everything in your relationship is going well, it's easy to be full of love for your partner and joy for life. But when there are problems, a crisis between the two of you, or even a small falling out, it's easy to doubt love and fall into one of three basic traps. Fortunately, there's a simple solution to this problem, which not only provides a new perspective on your relationship, but some tools for building a better and more secure and loving connection. My witness today is Charisse Cooke, who is a psychotherapist with 20 years' experience and the author of The Attachment Solution: How to Develop Secure, Strong and Lasting Relationships. She offers practical advice on Instagram too. So, how did your childhood prepare you to be an attachment-based psychotherapist and write this book?
Well, I had many attachment crises and traumas growing up because my father's work made us as a family move city and often country every 18 months. So my ability to form attachments, to feel secure and to have a sense of consistency, all such important facets of secure attachment, was very, very hindered. So I was very perfectly placed to recognize the importance of attachment later in life.
So what countries did you live in?
I was born in South Africa. My father was Irish and my mother was born in New Zealand. His work took him to South Africa, and I spent the first 8 years of my life, the longest period of my life, in one city in Johannesburg. And then my father moved to another city in South Africa called Durban, where we stayed for a couple of years. And then we moved first to England. We came here for the first time in my life, not the first time in their life. And we stayed here for our 18 months. And then we moved back to Durban. And then I went to university in the Cape. So I think we worked out that I went to 8 schools while I was growing up of my 16 years of education. That doesn't include university. So I was moving around and having to form attachments and having to leave attachments very, very regularly.
And so what did you think of England when you arrived here?
It was a huge shock because where I had just come from, Durban, experiences no seasons. It's just warm all the time. Occasionally, you might require a cardigan. And so when I moved to England, we moved to Cheshire. I was introduced to my first winter, and I was introduced to things like school dinners. And it was quite a revelation. It was hard. It was all hard. All the moving was incredibly hard. It was very, very challenging.
And so how do you think this impacted on you?
I think it made endings and beginnings and friendships something that was ultimately quite painful. I think the idea of relationships, or not the idea of relationships, but relationships in themselves were tinged with pain because it was either the awful beginning bit, and especially when you're young, when you don't know anyone and you want to make friends and who you're going to sit with at lunchtime, the agony of that, and then finally making friends and feeling a sense of belonging, and then that quickly ending and knowing it's also going to end, knowing it had an expiry date and that I would need to leave and then I would be back to square one somewhere else. So I think for me, I learned that relationships are tough and they're hard and they are painful and that they end. For many years after my childhood and my adolescence, I noticed in my first therapy, of course, we discovered this, that I have an internal clock of 18 months that I will naturally, in any friendship, relationship, work environment, anything, begin to feel an agitation and anxiety. Something should be changing. Something should be ending. it's an expectation that my body has. And it's been a while since I felt like that. It's nice remembering it now, but that's how I felt for a really long time. It was, I think, unfortunately, relationships were taught to me to be quite transitory.
And it's interesting hearing you talk, because I'm thinking for the first time about, we moved when I was 6 from Northampton to Bedford, which is sort of like half an hour in the car away. And all of our family originally came from Bedford. So I think, until I'm sitting here listening to you, underestimated how difficult that change was. It was a new school as well. Now, looking back, I think it was a much harder transition than I actually thought. And I think possibly a lot of people, when they think back, have underestimated the impact of these things. Would you agree with me on that?
Absolutely. For us, it was a fair time ago. And so there wasn't really this notion of really talking things through. I think that was one of the big themes that always came up in my therapy, was just, it would have been so wonderful to have just been heard and listened to a little bit about how difficult it was and how natural that would be to move and not know anyone. How daunting. Of course, that would be so daunting. Just to be taken into account a little bit more. I think it was just the powerlessness, especially as I grew older as a teenager. It felt very painful to just be moved around like that. So I think, yeah, it's easy to underestimate it because it's not really valued as much at the time for us.
Now, looking at your book and your various publishing on the internet and everywhere, there's a theme that comes through. So I'm going to sort of quote something which to me seems to be really very central in your work. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about it. And that is, love is an action rather than a feeling. Why is this message so important?
Well, specializing as I do now in relationships, and particularly romantic relationships, there's a lot that goes on in relationships that comes down to emotion. And I often say there's nothing more emotional than our relationships. They are the mirrors, they are the buttons that we're going to get pushed. All of that resides in our relationships. And we will do and say pretty much everything in our relationships based on how we're feeling. And as you said at the beginning of the podcast, when we're feeling good in our relationships, that will translate into good stuff into our relationship. However, our feelings are not reliable all the time, to say the very least. And our feelings are beautiful signposts and beautiful guides and beautiful things to be curious about. But when I'm working with couples and individuals, I'm very quick to teach them the difference between feeling how they feel and choosing to act in a way that is loving. So we might feel very justified or even entitled to rage and rant and be angry with our partners because of some huge slight that's taken place. But actually, we need to think about our actions a little bit more carefully, because we can be very, very reckless with one another. And that's, I guess, what I notice in my practice is there's a recklessness. There's an attitude of, this is how I feel, so I'm just going to say it, and I can do whatever I want with my feelings. And I believe that that is actually destructive for our relationships. We need to be much more mindful and intentional with how we behave.
And you think, or you believe, that because, you know that I love you, if I caught you a beep, a beep, beep in a moment of pressure, that you somehow know deep down that I don't really mean it. But actually, being called beep, beep, beep is really painful and it hurts.
Absolutely. And it's in those moments that we are very full of our own sad history and insecurities and completely out of tune with our partner's sad history and their insecurities. And I think that's what's quite painful and requires us to be so mature and adult in our relationships, because we are in a dynamic, we are in a to and fro. It isn't just about us. That's, I think, a bitter pill to swallow.
And a bit of a shock, really, to be perfectly honest.
A horrible shock every day.
But one of the upsides of that is that actually, if your partner is angry, we like to think, it's all about us, but possibly they're angry with other people, or half of the anger is due to old stuff, like, you might be annoyed with me because the 18 months button is up. And, how can I be responsible for that?
That's
So
absolutely
there are
right.
advantages for it not being all about us.
There was a chapter in the book that I wanted to have its title, The Joy of Blame, because I think that that's the truth of the situation, is that blame is so incredibly compelling for all of us. And it is an automatic, unconscious process that we need to become aware of. And when we're in a relationship, it's wonderful. We've struck gold. We finally have someone now to blame for everything. And we must be very careful we don't do that.
I don't think it's a chapter heading. I think it's a whole book, The Joy of Blame.
Absolutely. You can write next to the joy of sex, we can have the joy of blame. And there you've got relationships.
But love is an action rather than a feeling. How does that translate into day-to-day material?
I love working with clients on their daily lives, because for me, this is where love lives. Because love is not something we automatically do. We're so busy, we're rushing around. And there are things in life that take place. We have children, we have jobs, we have responsibilities, we have financial woes. And it's in those moments that other things can take precedence over love. Things like fear, things like annoyance and irritation. And after that heady, exciting beginning bit of a relationship, when love is this ecstasy that we enjoy on a daily, moment-to-moment basis, that does go. And then love needs to become a bit more of a decision, a bit more of a choice. When we are struggling with children, when we're struggling with money, when we're sharing a home and people do not do things the way we like them, we need to really dig deep and really consider the fact that when we say we love someone, that means acting in loving ways. It means choosing to be loving. And it means embodying love as best we can. And that takes quite a bit of conscious effort. It doesn't just come automatically. It requires effort. It requires demonstration.
So let's talk about attachment theory. Let's just cover it in general. How does it work and why is it important?
Well, attachment theory has the premise that based on how our caregivers attuned to us and responded to us and behaved with us and each other and the partners that they had while we were growing up, we learn how to do love. We learn what love is. We learn what it feels like to love. We learn to feel like what it's like if the person that we love that should be caring for us is displeased with us or angry with us or not around as much. And we learn what it's like when they hold us in their arms and we feel soothed and calmed and we think the world is safe, everything's going to be okay. So attachment theory for me is really quite beautiful, and it's a great insight into ourselves. And for us, the people that we work with, the people that we love, it's a huge, huge, huge insight into what we learned about love while we were growing up. And it continues into adulthood through the relationships that we have, the friendships that we have, because it really speaks of our ability to feel safe in relationship and how stressful we find relationships.
So there are, as I said, there are 3 traps that we can fall into. Obviously, it could be a wonderful situation where we're securely attached, which I think is something like 50% of the population, but the rest fall into other categories. And there are 3 particular ones that we're going to be looking at today. And the first one is anxious. So tell me about anxious attachment.
Anxious attachment speaks of when there's quite a bit of fear around relationships. We probably grew up with a degree of inconsistency in the care that we received. It was a bit unreliable. It was something that we couldn't really rely on. And so the seedling of doubt entered relationships for us. We just weren't quite sure of it. And then with that came an anxiety and also a little bit of a preoccupation with our caregivers. Where are they? What are they doing? Why aren't they there for me? So that really kind of sets us up in a way for responding to our adult relationships in similar ways.
And so there's often a feeling of concern that the other person isn't close enough, and it can end up with sort of pursuing the other person. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And while you're pursuing, they can be fleeing. So this is called avoidant, and there are two types of avoidant attachment. So let's do the first one, which is dismissive.
Dismissive avoidant is quite sneaky because it's a way of achieving a goal. And the goal is to create space and to create distance. And we do that without dismissiveness. So we're a bit offhand with the people in our lives. We're a bit aloof, and we can also be quite critical. We don't really value needs. We don't really value relationships. And so we go into this process of devaluing. So we can be kind of, oh, stop making such a big deal out of it. Or, oh God,
you
that's
need
so
to be
neat.
more independent.
Yes. We don't like feelings. Feelings are messy and inconvenient. So we would rather not have them, and we would rather the people around us didn't have them too. And we can be quite emotionally shut down. I think when we're in our anxious state, obviously we're not emotionally shut down, we're anxious. When we're dismissive avoidant, we're quite shut down, and we believe that to be our true emotional state. So we think, well, I'm fine. I don't have any feelings. I don't know why you do. That's your problem.
Don't be so sensitive.
Absolutely. Stop making such a big deal out of everything. Oh, yeah.
Then the next one is avoidant fearful.
Yes, fearful avoidant. Fearful avoidant is interesting because it's a bit of a mix. It's a mix of both anxious and avoidant. It used to be referred to as disorganized attachment. Nowadays, I just refer to it as fearful avoidant because it's on a spectrum and it does what it says on the tin a little bit more. And for us, when we're in relationships, there's a familiarity to chaos. We often were brought up in more dysfunctional homes, a lot of unpredictability, maybe parents who had their own quite serious issues. So there was a lot of fear in our home and a lot of chaos and dysfunction. And so we can grow up then expecting that and recreating that in our own relationships. But we want relationships. We want the connection. We always have, but they also feel really dangerous at the same time. So there's this push-pull, come here, go away kind of strategy that we have that can be very confusing for the people who are trying to love us.
So, confession time. I was on the avoidant end of the spectrum when I was younger. I mean, I've done quite a bit of work, and hopefully I don't think you can ever completely and utterly get rid of this material, but I'm very much more in the secure end now. Where did you start out? Were you anxious or avoidant?
One of the premises of my book is that we are sort of all the attachment styles. Depending on where we are and who we are with, we can respond in all these ways because they're sort of defensive in nature. It's a coping strategy, or it's a trap, as you say. So it's interesting to think about during one's life where one might fall.
I think we have a core thing. We tend to end up in the same patterns. I've had 2 long, significant relationships, and I've actually ended up playing different roles in the 2 places. But ultimately, psychologically, I think you feel more comfortable in particular places, or the trap is more enticing.
Well, we're always evolving, I guess. I used to work with adolescents, and it was just my observation that particularly boys, young men, could often be initially quite anxious in how they attached. And then they would have 1 or 2 bad experiences, and the pendulum would swing quite dramatically to the avoidant side. And that's where they would sort of stay. And I found that quite sad. I guess it speaks of our protective nature and how we want to protect ourselves. But yeah, I suppose when I was younger, my predominant is definitely fearful avoidant. But when I was younger, I'm questioning now if I was more anxious or more avoidant. I was definitely extremely avoidant with my family. But then underneath, I felt this anxiety. So yes, I think for me, I'll have to say that fearful avoidant is my strongest one in times of stress. Now, luckily, I've been married. I've been in a long-term relationship. I've worked very hard to be secure.
Would you agree with me that there are times when you still end up going back to that small child, maybe even only for a moment, or do you think you can actually become entirely securely attached?
I think depending on the severity of what we've gone through in our life and the experiences that we've had, I don't know if anyone is always completely secure, to be honest. I always find the 50% statistic a bit of an optimistic one. But yeah, in times of...
There are people with attachment problems and there are liars.
Exactly. I mean, self-reporting isn't always the best way of checking anything, as we all know. We can all recognize a right answer when we see one. And we aren't often very aware of ourselves, are we? We often feel that our reactions are completely natural and normal. And you would behave in this very angry way too, and this cruel manner too, if you were hurt. But yeah, I feel like we are all coming in and out of different ways of attaching, depending on how safe we feel. So for those of us with very extreme experiences from when we were young, we can do really well to become secure as often as we can and as much as we can. But we must also give ourselves grace that we will respond with a bit of insecurity occasionally, and we will respond imperfectly. And for me, that's quite human, and everything is relative to each of us and our own experiences.
Yeah, but this is a sort of a helpful image rather than a cast iron prison, I think is the best way of looking at it. But how can we tell which attachment style we have? Any sort of clues?
Well, I think we can question how we respond to stress in relationships or difficulty or conflict, because the way we attach will be revealed in our behavior and our reactions. Reactivity is very helpful. So if we are anxiously attached, when we are stressed or concerned, we will become hypervigilant in the relationship. We become preoccupied with it. We often overfunction. We pursue the other person. We are wanting connection, wanting closeness. We're often also very reassurance seeking. So tell me it's okay. Tell me that you love me, because there's this fear in us that we are about to experience a loss, or perhaps that there's a threat to the relationship. When someone's moving away from us or there's difficulty, our automatic feeling is I'm about to be abandoned and I'm frightened. So I need to mitigate against that in every possible way.
So let's imagine that our listeners are anxious. What advice, what help do you give them to be able to deal with that anxiety?
There are two extremely important tools and skills that I offer to my clients and myself and you and all of us, which is emotional regulation and recognizing distorted thinking. Because two things are happening in our anxiety is that our nervous system is activated and we're going into some sort of survival mode, and our thinking gets skewed to the negative. So for anyone who's experienced anxious attachment or insecure attachment, really, we can recognize it in our thoughts. We go into perhaps a familiar narrative, a familiar script of I'm about to be left, I'm not good enough, I never get what I want, this person isn't loving me enough, when will it all work out for me, etc., etc. We can question what are the familiar narratives to us that we can recognize through our thinking, and recognize that is distorted thinking. And I want this to be a wonderful revelation. It's like, I'm very quick to say we cannot trust our thoughts, because our thoughts really do throw fuel on the fire of our already activated nervous system.
We cannot trust our thoughts. I don't think we can say that too often. So let's say it for a third time. We cannot trust our thoughts.
Do not trust your thoughts, especially when you're stressed, especially when you're angry.
If you still feel the same way the next day, then we're prepared to listen to those thoughts.
That's right. Well, I often say in a few weeks' time, because that's how long a process can be sometimes.
And how do you do emotional regulation?
Well, emotional regulation, I think, is really useful because we can recognize that we are dysregulated. And I think this is something that we don't really want to do, because we feel very justified in these moments, and we can swell up into self-righteous indignation and grandiosity if we're a bit more avoidant. or we can collapse into despair and worrying if we are anxious or fearful, avoidant. So emotional regulation is crucial. And there are so many skills. We need to find what works for us. Sometimes it's breath work. Sometimes it's meditation. Sometimes it's taking ourselves away and going on a walk or a run. Sometimes it'll be playing with a pet. Sometimes it will be doing a visualization, eating something calming, having a bath, punching a pillow. We've got to figure out ways that soothe the system, allow us perhaps to express some of what we're feeling so we can write it out, we can talk it out onto a voice note, we can speak to a therapist. But there needs to be a practice, I think, in our lives if we are to take responsibility for ourselves and how we are in relationships and to become more secure. We need to rein ourselves in.
Because however much our partners love us, it's not their job to emotionally regulate us, is it?
There's some relationship work that we can do that would be around co-regulation, which is something really beautiful. But I agree with you that ultimately it is our own personal responsibility to look after our emotions, especially when we are in interaction with our partners. But I definitely also encourage the people I work with to not rile each other up, which is the other thing that people can do, of course, is that rather than calm each other down or recognize that the situation isn't helpful and is getting worse, we actually escalate and escalate and escalate. And that's a big, big trap.
So what if we're avoidant? What are the skills there?
Well, avoidance is useful because the name can shed light on the fact that we do tend to shy away from things. We do tend to avoid things. And relationships, we feel when we're avoidant, are quite demanding. So we tend to avoid responsibility. We tend to avoid long, difficult conversations in relationships. We'd rather not do that. That feels awkward. It feels unnecessary. And if we're dismissive, we think it's silly and we're not going to do that. So something very specific to look for with avoidance is being shut down in our relationships. This is particularly true of dismissive avoidant, but also true of fearful avoidant. We retreat into ourselves, we stonewall, we withdraw, and we can emotionally shut down, we can emotionally numb out. And this is a preferred space. It's a nice space because we're not bothered by what's going on. We can be quite superior sometimes in that we're fine. We don't feel anything and we're kind of leaving the difficulty, which isn't us. So it's quite difficult in our avoidance. There's a lot of denial around our emotional truth in relationships. We think and feel sort of quite disparaging thoughts and don't feel a lot. And so we think that we're okay in relationships, but our partners are often reflecting back something quite different to us. And that's, I think, a clue to recognize I'm being avoidant here because I'm not seeing things that are taking place and I'm not experiencing things in the same way.
I mean, what I always say is it's really important at this point to negotiate because nobody minds if you need a break for half an hour or even, 45 minutes, a couple of hours. But you need to let people know, I'm actually overloaded at this moment. I need a 15-minute break and then I can talk some more. They'll let you go under those circumstances. But if you're going to go and they've no idea whether you're coming back in half an hour or 3 weeks' time, there's going to be quite a lot of anxiety there.
That's right. And that's, I think, what happens a lot in our relationships is that if we are slightly more anxious in the way we attach, we will attract a more avoidant partner and vice versa. And that's often a very painful dynamic that takes place, which is having two people or more in a relationship with completely contrasting needs and contrasting ways of relating that can really cause a lot of suffering and actually exacerbate one another's either anxiety or avoidance. So that is really something to negotiate, as you say.
So it's a bit like a dance, really. One person comes forward, the other one goes back, and there's a sort of a moment somewhere in between where you're close enough for one person and not too close to the other person, and we have a magic moment that we sort of want to get back to, but then the dance goes on and the distance gets too great to the point that you think, oh, we've got to come back, get together again. Then we're going back again. It's a bit like the hokey pokey, you put your left leg in, your left leg out, and you shake it all about. And I think once you begin to understand it's a dance and, you've been through it 100 times before and it's unpleasant, but, you survived the last 300 rounds of the hokey cokey and you can probably do another version of it. But, let's possibly make it a little less shaking about at the same time.
That's it. I'm a big fan of people negotiating when they're not in an activated state, when they're not in a time of stress and difficulty, when our emotions are heightened and our defenses are at play, when we're the least defensive, to begin to negotiate and say, listen, when we hit tough times, what works for you? What do you need? What is the best way of dealing with it from your perspective? Because this is going to happen. We're going to disagree or there's going to be difficulty. So what should we just watch out for? You tell me things from your perspective and then I'll tell you things from my perspective.
And what's really important is that once you've actually got this deal, you need to stick to it. Because if you put the deal together and then under the stress, you think, oh, blow this for a game of soldiers, it's not going to work. It might be that you need to go back and you need to reorganize things, because to say I'm going to come back after half an hour might be too much. And it might be after half an hour you have to come back and say, look, I'm feeling much better, but I'm not ready to talk yet, and then negotiate when you could talk. So you probably won't get it right first time, but you do have to keep talking. I mean, I can't stress that too much. You have to keep talking.
Absolutely. And I think there doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out conversation and talking about it, because that is the fear of the avoidant. But it is true to be able to stay connected. We can withstand these conversations. We can do it. And often when we start doing it and start negotiating and then we hit a bump in the road, that's when self-awareness can actually develop, because we realize, oh, I don't really want to be part of this conversation now. And I do think and we begin to notice our behavior a little bit more, because our partner has perhaps said, it's just really difficult for me when there's this avalanche of stuff coming at me, I will just shut down. And maybe we can recognize, oh, maybe I do sometimes lose control a little bit of how I'm expressing myself, and I should really stay in control and be succinct and also be constructive. Or I really shut down the minute something happens. I need to work on remaining open. This is when it can become quite interesting and quite dynamic.
And generally deal with things a little bit earlier, because, if you've got 20 issues between the two of you, you're not going to be able to sort those out. You might manage 5, but if you store them up, you're going to have one of these overload things. And both parties can be a little bit avoidant, because the anxious person doesn't want to spoil the good times, and the avoidant person doesn't want to talk about anything anyway. And so we can quite easily get into a whole pile of material. And so I think if you're the anxious person, speaking up a little bit earlier when you're calmer is very much appreciated by the avoidant person and makes for a much better conversation.
I think that's very sound advice. That's why, in a way, for me, the emotional regulation is so key, because all 3 traps are about a dysregulation. When we're anxious, we're dysregulated and we can vent and we can become quite critical and fault-finding and negative, and we express that profoundly. When we're avoidant, we can become very negative in our thinking and we can lose control of our thinking, and that can become very, very negative. And shutting down, I'm very quick to tell people, that is not a sign of regulation. Shutting down is dysregulation. We are not as in control as we think. We have lost control. And so it's very important, because just because we're not overtly emotional, it doesn't mean we're not dysregulated, and we need to regulate ourselves. So the emotional regulation is really, really key. And then that's what allows the avoidant to actually stay a bit connected, and for the more anxiously attached person to be calmed sufficiently to really communicate in ways that increases connection. So these 2 things can happen at the same time. That's when we're really winning.
I love the way you call out the shutting down, because you're right, it isn't actually regulation, it is dysregulation. So Thank you for that. I'm going to hold that one close to me. So in a moment, we're going to look at a letter that's been written in and see if this attachment theory is going to help us have a new perspective on that.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Please follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material and other benefits.
You can participate in the programme by going to www.andrewgmarshall.com/podcasts, where you'll find a way to participate in the programme and also sign up for our newsletter as well. My husband and I have been married for 15 years, and the more I think about it, the more our issues boil down to one: being flexible. While I'll do my best to accommodate his desires and interests, even if I don't particularly want to do something, because that's part of the deal of being one half of a couple or part of a family. However, he tends to say no straight away, and if I get upset, really upset, he will possibly think it through. It is very exhausting. When I've tried to talk about it, he says his job is less flexible than mine, which is true, but it's more a state of mind. We had a fight recently because I told him about our daughter's hockey game, but he claims I didn't. He's fixed something that clashes and doesn't see why he should change it. Apparently, it's a matter of principle. Sometimes I get really upset because it feels like he doesn't take my feelings or my daughter's into consideration.
Well, this sadly is a very common situation in relationships, is it not? From an attachment perspective, I can clearly see some avoidance here in this person's partner, and I can hear the pain of this person. Do we know if this is a male-female couple?
I think so, yes.
Okay. So potentially I can hear her pain coming out. And when I read this letter, I thought of the personality traits. I thought of agreeableness, that it's such a good understanding of personality and what we are dealing with, because this husband sounds not very agreeable with many things, this inflexibility that she describes. So in that way, there's a real rigidity and belief in his own view. So I think in this situation, for me, it's an incredibly common one that I've worked with so many times. And I think what's very difficult around this is the question of what is there to work with here? In the nature of a relationship, we have to look and see if the door is open or closed with our partner. And I can really hear in this person's letter the frustration and sadness around what's going on. And it's particularly upsetting because, of course, there are children involved. And as a parent, we always want our parent to come in as much as possible to be there for our children so we can not let our children down, not disappoint them, and not upset them. So my advice on this letter would be for this woman to not be quite so accommodating and to do something that's probably going to feel incredibly counterintuitive, which is to accept the status quo. Because I sense if she isn't already doing it, she is in incredible danger of becoming a rescuer and a fixer and trying to rescue the situation, becoming a bit codependent and wanting so much from her husband. And in doing that, sending him further and further into the extreme of his inflexibility and his rigidity. There's something that I've heard so many times over the years, and it's led me to this phrase, which is, let your partner be who they are. Because that is what he's really saying. He's saying, this is who I am. And it's through a lack of acceptance of that we actually almost entrench each other's positions more and more. Because in many ways, she's taking responsibility for his behavior and actions. He's making choices. He's living the life that he's living, and she's taking it upon herself to try to make it okay for her daughter, to want things to be different in her marriage. Of course, what could be more natural? But we can't control other people. We cannot take responsibility for them. We can try to work with them and to be more proactive within ourselves. But can we change other people? We cannot.
So not only has she got a problem with her husband, but she's also incredibly unhappy about the problem with her husband because she's forever trying to push him to, for an example, turn up for the hockey match. But what you're saying is accept that he's a disagreeable bugger some of the times, excuse my language, and just say to yourself, well, it's his loss. And actually, you're not responsible for his relationship with his daughter. He is responsible for that. I mean,
That's right.
if your daughter's upset, you can listen to her and pick up the pieces, but going into battle with her, being so closely identified with her, is probably going to make the whole situation more difficult.
That's correct. And it's so agonizing as a parent because obviously you don't want that for your child. However, that is the reality. And so often in our fixing and our fretting and our worrying, there's a lack of acceptance there. That's us pushing back against reality the whole time. It's kind of, this is the way he is. This is going to be the relationship that his daughter probably has with him. Or conversely, within our acceptance, we allow for other options. We allow for the daughter to be disappointed and say, Dad, where were you? I missed you.
Perhaps the two of them can find their way to doing something that actually both of them want to do. I mean, I'm just pulling an idea out of the sky. They want to go off on a camping trip together. That he's not interested in hockey, and it's not the end of the world for her if her father's not on the touch line.
That's right. That's right. They are going to have to find their own way. And indeed, this woman is going to have to find her own way with her husband too. But there's something incredibly powerful about acceptance, which is we can relax into something and different things can emerge. The husband may feel, controlled or being told what to do by the wife. So his belligerence is going to get a little bit higher. If he's not feeling that, who knows? He could become more accommodating and more open. But what's clear is what's happening now doesn't feel healthy. And it specifically doesn't feel healthy for this woman who I suspect is going through a lot of pain and upset by observing what is going on. And I would like her to be a little less accommodating and a little less trying to make everything okay, because she's putting herself in the middle of something here, and that's going to be painful.
And I think this phrase, it's a matter of principle, suggests that actually it's not just about the hockey match, and that somehow it's being made to be about something more than just the hockey match. And if you unhook everything else and it's just about the hockey match, suddenly the stakes are much lower and it doesn't really matter so much. I hope that was helpful. And if you'd like to send us a letter to be discussed on a future episode, go to my website and look for Participate in the Programme. So we're heading towards the end of the programme. So I need to ask you, what makes your life meaningful?
I loved this question, and I loved how it made me think, because I feel I enjoy a lot of meaning in my life. It was fun to reflect on what and how and why. And I know we're not meant to have our work define us, but I think you and I are incredibly fortunate with the work that we do, because there is a lot of meaning in it. And I enjoy so much accompanying people on their journeys at very specific times in their life. It's such a humbling, incredible experience, sometimes extremely challenging. But I find so much meaning in my life. And I especially feel that because I've worked with many people, and I have many people in my life who feel they've just never quite found their place in the world when it comes to work and their career. And I have an incredibly fortunate feeling, which is I am doing exactly what I'm meant to be doing. And that is such an incredible privilege for us to feel in our work. So for me, my meaning comes from doing a little bit of good and actively participating in helping people, helping myself, becoming wiser and helping other people become wiser, that for me is the best utilization of my time. And it has so much meaning.
Well, I would like to talk to you for much longer, and I will for a bit longer in the bonus material. So if you'd like to hear the rest of our conversation, we're going to be talking about how to nurture trust, because trust is something that's really important in relationships. How do you nurture it? What are the tools? We'll be talking about that in the bonus material. And if you want to hear that material, you can subscribe directly via Apple or Spotify. And we're also available on Amazon Music. And if you want to become a supporter of The Meaningful Life, here are the details.
You've been listening to The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. You can follow Andrew on Twitter, like him on Facebook, and please leave a review wherever you consume your podcasts. Making, editing, and distributing The Meaningful Life comes with substantial costs, and we'd like to ask for your help. Visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material for every program, send in a letter to be discussed by Andrew and his guests, and join a community of other people seeking to make their life meaningful. At the gold level, you get even more benefits. Production of The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall is by Michael Dooney. Social media by Madeleine Healy. Sound engineering and theme tune by Sebastian de la Luz Mendoza. And I'm Susie Colick. Please tell your friends and spread the word. Thank you.